On one night, Ilara lost everything. Her husband, her home, her dreams all gone in the blink of an eye. But that was not the end of her story, because in the silence after screams, something extraordinary happened. She saw what no widow dares to believe, her husband returning, not in body but in spirit. This is not only a tale of loss, but of rebirth. Stay with me through these 3 hours, and you will walk with Ilara through grief, through shadows, and into the stillness of Buddhist wisdom. And when her story ends, it will become yours. A lantern for your own night, and a gentle hand to guide you into peaceful sleep. Before sorrow carved its deep lines into her face, before her nights were swallowed by silence, there was a woman named Ilara who knew the warmth of a life filled with laughter. Her marriage had been the axis of her world, a steady flame that glowed with tenderness and constancy. To her, every morning was a gift wrapped in sunlight, and every evening a promise renewed beneath the stars. She remembered the first time she saw him, Arik, standing by the riverside where the village children used to gather to wash and play. His smile was unguarded, his eyes unclouded by doubt or shadow, and she felt then, with a quiet certainty, that life had arranged this meeting long before either of them was born. To be in his presence was to breathe in serenity. To share words with him was to touch the edges of eternity. Their marriage was not one marked by wealth or grandeur, but by simplicity and devotion. They shared a modest home with walls painted in the colors of the earth, warmed by the fire they tended together each night. Ilara would often sit by the wooden window frame, weaving simple cloth, while Arik returned from the fields, his hands roughened by labor, but his spirit never dulled. They lived not for riches, but for the quiet intimacy of shared existence. Every morning followed the rhythm of their companionship. He would rise before dawn, the sound of roosters blending with the soft whistle of his breath. She would prepare his meal, laying out rice and herbs, a cup of warm tea. There was joy in these rituals, for they were more than habits, they were the language of love, the silent vows spoken anew each day. On warm afternoons, Arik would guide her to the orchard they tended together. The apple trees, with branches heavy from years of nurturing, became their sanctuary. She loved the way sunlight fell upon his face as he reached for the fruit, and he adored the laughter that escaped her lips when birds swooped down, mischievous, to steal what they had grown. Even in these small moments, their love seemed to expand beyond their bodies, filling the very air around them. But love, true love, was not built on joy alone. There were quarrels, sharp words spoken in the heat of exhaustion, nights when silence lay heavy between them. Yet, without fail, morning returned them to one another. She would touch his arm lightly, as if to say, "We are more than this anger." He would bring her wildflowers as if to answer, "I will always find my way back to you." Their reconciliation was the very essence of their devotion. Forgiveness stitched seamlessly into their days. The villagers admired them, whispering often about their bond. "They move as though one soul," an elder once said, as if fate itself bound them long before they knew it. Young couples sought their counsel. Lonely widows envied the warmth that seemed to radiate from their home. Yet Ilara and Arik never thought themselves extraordinary. To them, love was not a miracle, but a practice, a daily tending, like firewood gathered to keep the hearth alive. Their most cherished moments were the evenings. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in molten gold, they would sit together at the threshold of their home. Eric's stories flowed like river water, tales of his youth, of dreams half forgotten. Ilara would listen, her head resting gently against his shoulder, the world beyond their embrace fading into insignificance. Sometimes they sat in silence, their hands entwined, and in that silence they felt the vastness of a universe that required no words. In the heart of such a marriage, time seemed generous. Days unfolded with the grace of seasons, predictable yet precious. Ilara believed their bond was unbreakable, as enduring as the mountains, as constant as the tide. She could not imagine a dawn without his footsteps, nor a night without his voice beside her. Her very identity had entwined with his wife, partner, confidante, beloved. And so, this was the life before the storm, a life of woven laughter, shared burdens, and quiet rituals, a life where love seemed eternal, untouched by the fragility of human fate. Yet beneath the steady surface of their joy, impermanence was waiting, silent and patient. As the Buddha once taught, all compounded things are subject to dissolution. The house they built, the orchard they tended, even the rhythm of their days, all were fragile threads, destined one day to unravel. But Ilara did not know this yet. She was still living within the embrace of her husband's smile, still trusting the constancy of his hand in hers. To her, tomorrow was a certainty, not a gift. Loss was a story she heard of others, not a chapter she believed her life would ever contain. The memory of those days would later cut deep into her heart, becoming both knife and salve, painful because they were gone, healing because they proved she had once truly lived and loved. It is here, in this moment of fullness, that her story begins. For every tragedy is born in the shadow of joy, and every lesson in the Dharma begins with the illusion that what we hold dear will last forever. The night began like any other, cloaked in the comfort of familiarity. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of soil after a day's labor. Ilara had prepared their evening meal, a modest feast of rice, vegetables, and a small portion of roasted fish. Eric had come home later than usual, his shoulders tired from the harvest, but his smile no less warm. He sat across from her, the flickering lamplight casting golden shadows across his face. They ate slowly, speaking of small things, the orchard, the neighbor's new child, the coming of the monsoon. Ilara found herself laughing at a clumsy joke he made, her heart light, unaware that fate had already set in motion a parting she could not prevent. After dinner, Eric rose from his chair and stood by the doorway. He gazed at the night sky, where stars glimmered faintly behind drifting clouds. "The air feels different tonight," he said softly, almost to himself. Ilara joined him, resting her hand against his. "It feels like any other," she answered, her voice casual, but a faint unease tugged at her chest. There was something about the stillness, something that pressed on the edges of her awareness. Eric leaned down to kiss her forehead. "I'll go check the storage barn," he said. "I heard the animals restless earlier. I won't be long." She wanted to protest, to ask him to wait until morning, but she saw in his eyes the sense of responsibility he always carried. He was a man who never ignored duty, so she only nodded, brushing her fingers along his arm as if to anchor him. The lantern in his hand glowed faintly as he stepped into the night. She watched until the dark swallowed his figure, the light bobbing like a fragile star before disappearing behind the orchard trees. Inside, the silence thickened. Ilara tidied the table, folded the cloths, but her mind was restless. Minutes stretched longer than usual. She told herself he would return soon, that nothing was wrong. Yet her heart fluttered with an unnamed dread. The wind rose suddenly, rattling the shutters. Clouds gathered with unusual speed, swallowing the moon. The still night became a churning sky, its quiet broken by the low growl of distant thunder. Ilara stepped to the doorway, peering into the orchard, her chest tightening. Then, faintly, she heard it, a cry carried on the wind, not of joy, not of play, but sharp and desperate. It was Arik's voice. Her body froze, her mind refusing to understand. For a moment she thought she imagined it, a trick of the storm. But then it came again, urgent, echoing between the trees. Without thought, she ran barefoot into the night, the earth cold beneath her feet, the lantern she carried trembling in her grip. The orchard loomed ahead, its branches clawing at the sky. The wind whipped through leaves like restless spirits. "Arik!" she cried, her voice straining against the storm. No answer. Her lantern light revealed glimpses, scattered tools, a broken fence post, the door of the barn swinging violently. The animals inside whined and kicked, spooked by forces unseen. She searched desperately, her breath ragged. At last, near the barn, she found the lantern Arik had carried, lying shattered on the ground. Its flame had died, leaving only shards of glass glinting like cold tears. Fear surged like a tide within her. She called his name again, her throat raw. Only the storm replied. The first drops of rain fell, heavy and unrelenting. The sky split with lightning, illuminating the orchard in a cruel brilliance. And there, in that fleeting flash, she thought she saw him. His figure collapsed near the edge of the barn. Her legs carried her forward, her heart slamming against her ribs. She reached him, trembling, and dropped to her knees. His eyes were half open, his breath shallow. Blood streaked his temple where the barn beam had struck. "No," she whispered, gathering him into her arms. "No, not you, not tonight." His lips moved, faintly, painfully. She leaned close, straining to hear. "Ilara, don't be afraid." His hand sought hers, gripping weakly. "Everything changes, even this." And then, with a final exhale, the strength left his body. His hand loosened, falling heavy against the earth. His eyes, once so full of light, closed into stillness. The storm raged above, but within Ilara there was only silence, a silence vast and merciless, swallowing every sound, every breath, every hope. She clutched him to her chest, rocking back and forth, her cries lost to the roaring sky. The night had taken her husband. The world she had built upon his presence had shattered in an instant. What was once full of joy had become a void too wide to fathom. And as the rain fell harder, mingling with her tears, Ilara realized this was not just the night of his departure. It was the night her life, as she had known it, ceased to exist. Her story of love had turned to a story of loss, and the journey ahead would not be toward reunion, but toward understanding. This was the beginning of the darkness through which she would stumble, searching for a light she did not yet believe could exist. The morning after his death arrived, not with warmth, but with a bleakness that stretched across the horizon. The storm had passed, but its remnants lingered in broken branches, fallen fences, and the heavy smell of damp earth. Ilara sat by his body through the long night, refusing to believe that the warmth in his chest had vanished forever. She had whispered his name again and again, as though repetition might tether his spirit back into his form, but the silence remained unbroken. By dawn, the village gathered. Word of loss travels faster than any wind, and neighbors approached with bowed heads and hesitant footsteps. Some carried cloths, others wood. A few brought food that Ilara could not eat. Their eyes met hers with a sorrow that reflected her own, yet she felt no comfort. Their pity seemed to deepen her loneliness, a reminder that no one could cross the chasm that had opened inside her. The elder of the village placed a hand on her shoulder. "We will prepare the rites," he said softly. "Let him go with honor." Ilara nodded, though her mind screamed in defiance. Let him go? How does one release the very soul that had defined her days? How does one bury not only a body, but the dreams that body had carried, the whispered plans, the shared laughter, the tender vows spoken under starlight? The villagers built the pyre by the riverbank, as tradition demanded. Arik's body was washed and dressed in simple white cloth. His face looked strangely peaceful, as though sleep had claimed him. Ilara's hands trembled as she touched his forehead, cool beneath her palm. She wanted to speak to him, to beg him not to leave her in this hollow silence, but the words withered in her throat, choking her like thorns. The flames were lit at sunset. The fire caught quickly, devouring the wood, the cloth, the form of the man she loved. Sparks rose into the darkening sky like scattered stars, carried away by the wind. Ilara's knees gave out, and she collapsed onto the earth, her cries torn from her chest like wild birds breaking free. The villagers sang the old chants, voices low and rhythmic, reminding the living of impermanence, urging them to accept what must be. But Ilara could not accept. To her, the chants felt like knives. Every syllable was another demand that she surrender him to the void. As the fire consumed him, she remembered their first meeting. His awkward smile, the way he carried water jugs as though they were feathers, the quiet strength in his voice when he asked her to share her life with him. She remembered the birth of their child who had not survived infancy, the way Arik had held her through that loss, whispering that they still had each other. Now even that promise was gone. The fire roared, brighter and brighter, until it seemed the sky itself burned. Ilara's tears blurred the light, turning it into a river of gold. She whispered into the flames, "Take me with you. Don't leave me here, in this place where everything reminds me of what I've lost." But the flames only answered with crackles and sighs, as if mocking the futility of her plea. By midnight, the pyre had turned to embers. The villagers departed one by one, leaving food, leaving words, leaving silence. Ilara remained, staring at the ashes. She felt as though she was staring at the grave of her own heart. It was not just her husband that had been burned that night. It was the life they had built together. The dreams of raising children, of growing old side by side, of seasons spent in laughter and struggle, all reduced to smoke, carried into a sky that gave no answer. In that moment, she understood what no teaching had ever prepared her for. Death does not only claim the body, it claims the future, the unseen, the yet to come. It steals not just the man, but the music of mornings and the comfort of nights. Ilara bowed her head into her hands and sobbed until no sound remained. She was emptied out, hollowed by grief. The funeral was not only his, it was theirs. It was the funeral of their shared dreams, the extinguishing of a story written together. And yet, in the hollow silence that followed, a strange question rose within her heart. If everything she had clung to could vanish in a single night, what, if anything, remained? She did not yet know it. But this question would become the beginning of a path, one that led not away from her suffering, but through it, into a truth deeper than even her despair. For now, she only wept beside the ashes, unaware that the first seed of transformation had been planted in her broken heart. The embers of the pyre still glowed faintly when Ilara returned to her home. The path was silent, the air damp with night. Every step echoed with emptiness, each sound reminding her that Arik's footsteps would never fall beside hers again. She pushed open the door, and the hollow creak of wood felt like the sigh of a ghost. Inside, the house was too quiet. The hearth where he once warmed his hands was cold. The chair by the window, where he used to sit after long days in the fields, stood waiting in vain. His cup rested on the table, as though he might return any moment to fill it with tea, but no hand would reach for it. No voice would break the stillness. Ilara sat on the floor, clutching the cup, and pressed it against her chest as if it carried his warmth. She rocked back and forth, whispering his name, her voice trembling into the darkness. "Arik, Arik, come back." Her words dissolved into the void, unanswered, as though the walls themselves had swallowed them whole. The hours dragged. Every creak of the house seemed to mock her. Shadows stretched and twisted, playing tricks on her weary mind. At one moment, she thought she saw him in the corner, standing just beyond the edge of lamplight. She reached out her hand, heart pounding with hope. But the figure melted back into darkness, leaving her gasping with fresh pain. She lay on their bed, but the emptiness beside her was unbearable. She could still smell him on the pillow, a faint trace of earth and smoke, and the wild herbs he used to gather. She pressed her face against it, sobbing until the fabric was drenched. Sleep came in jagged fragments, each one shattered by dreams where he walked toward her, only to vanish when she tried to hold him. Sometime past midnight, a storm rose again. Rain lashed the roof, wind howled through the shutters, thunder rolled like drums of war. Ilara sat upright, shaking, heart racing. For a moment, she felt as though the storm itself carried his voice, calling her name from somewhere beyond. She ran to the door, threw it open, and stared into the blackness. The rain soaked her instantly, cold and merciless. "Where are you?" she screamed into the tempest. "Why did you leave me here? Take me with you." Her cry was swallowed by the wind, vanishing into the night. She collapsed to her knees in the mud, trembling, broken. The storm raged around her, but inside she felt nothing but a hollow ache, a silence deeper than the thunder. She realized then that no matter how loud she screamed, the answer she sought would never come from outside. The world would not return him, the night would not yield him, and so she returned inside, drenched and shivering, and sat by the dark hearth. She wrapped herself in his old cloak, inhaling the scent, and stared at the dying flame of the lamp. Each flicker seemed to taunt her with impermanence. Nothing stayed, not the flame, not the man she loved, not even the tears that blurred her eyes until they ran dry. The night stretched endlessly. Minutes felt like hours, hours like years. Alone, she wandered through the corridors of her grief, a prisoner of memories. She spoke to the air as though it were him. She begged the silence for mercy. She promised she would give anything, her breath, her body, her future, if only she could see him once more. By dawn, her body was heavy with exhaustion. She had not slept, but her tears had ceased. They had left her hollow, emptied out like a vessel that had poured everything it had. And in that hollow space, beneath the ashes of her despair, something faint stirred. Not hope, not yet, but a question, a whisper inside her. If everything can be taken, what is left that cannot? She did not understand the whisper. She only knew that she could not survive many more nights like this. Something within her longed for relief, though she had no idea where to find it. And so the night ended, not with peace, but with a fragile awareness that her suffering had reached its deepest point. The silence had spoken to her, not with comfort, but with a challenge, to live on in a world emptied of him. The dawn rose pale, casting a faint silver light across the village. But in Ilara's heart, no sun rose. She stood before the small shrine outside her home, her body trembling with exhaustion. Her eyes were swollen from nights of tears, her lips cracked from whispered prayers that never seemed to reach any god or spirit. She placed her husband's cloak upon the altar, the last possession of his that still carried his warmth. The fabric clung to her hands, and she could almost imagine him wrapping it around her shoulders as he once did on cold mornings. She pressed her forehead against it, and the dam of her grief broke open again. "Why him?" she cried, her voice raw, breaking through the still morning air. "Why did you take him from me? Was it not enough that we loved each other honestly, that we worked the soil with our hands, that we shared everything we had? Was it not enough that we harmed no one?" Her words pierced the silence, rising into the sky like arrows. Birds scattered from the trees as if startled by her anguish. She did not notice. She sank to her knees, fists pounding against the earth. "Why me?" she shouted. "Why must I remain when he is gone? Why leave me with this emptiness, this silence that devours me whole? If life is only to love and lose, then what is the point of breathing at all?" The world answered only with silence. The mountains in the distance stood unmoved. The river flowed as it always had, indifferent to her cries. The heavens gave no sign, no thunder, no light. Only the vast, echoing emptiness returned her words, as though mocking the smallness of her suffering in the face of the infinite. Her heart clenched with rage. She lifted her face to the sky, eyes blazing. If there is a God, then he is cruel. If there is fate, then it is heartless. If there is nothing, her voice broke, and the last word dissolved into sobs. "Then let me disappear into it. Let me go to him." She pressed the cloak to her face, breathing in his scent until it was all that filled her lungs. She prayed not for life, but for death. She begged to be taken. She whispered through tears, "Take me to where he has gone. Let me cross whatever threshold he crossed. I am not afraid. I only wish to see him again." The wind rose suddenly, rushing through the trees, carrying with it a sound like a sigh. Ilara froze. For an instant, she felt as if the air itself had leaned close to listen. The leaves quivered, the cloak rippled, and in that fragile moment, she thought she heard his voice. Soft, distant, a whisper carried by the wind. "Ilara." Her breath caught. She stood, searching the empty air, her eyes wide. "Arik?" she whispered, but there was no figure, no form, only the endless sky stretching above her. The moment passed, and the silence returned heavier than before. She collapsed onto the ground once more, arms outstretched, palms pressed into the earth. Her sobs tore through her chest until her body could bear no more. Then, at last, she lay still, trembling with the exhaustion of grief, staring upward at the sky. The heavens had not answered her plea with miracles, but something inside her shifted that morning. The scream she hurled into the vast emptiness did not vanish entirely, it echoed within her. And in that echo was the faintest awareness that if she could not follow him into death, she would have to walk further into life, carrying the unbearable weight. The widow's cry to the heavens was not the end of her despair, but the breaking of her silence. It was the moment when her grief became so vast, it touched something beyond herself, a threshold between pain and the possibility of transformation. And though she did not yet understand it, this cry was the seed of her journey, a cry not only to the heavens, but to the depths of her own soul, which now stood waiting for an answer. Night did not come so much as it gathered like a shawl placed over her shoulders by hands she could not see. Ilara had spent the day moving through her house, as if through a museum of vanished things. She folded Arik's cloak and unfolded it again. She straightened a chair that needed no straightening. She held his cup, feeling for warmth that wasn't there. By dusk, grief had worn her down to a thin thread. She lay on the floor beside the small shrine, the cloak across her chest like a second skin, and let exhaustion carry her where will could not. At first, there were only the ordinary sounds of evening, crickets whispering in the grass, a faint wind testing the shutters. Then a subtler sound twined itself among them, soft, familiar, impossible. Footsteps. Not any footsteps, but his. The rhythm she had known without ever counting, the quiet confidence of a man who moved through a home he loved. The hinge of the door sighed the way it used to. The latch found its place with the same gentle click that had once meant, "You're safe, I'm here." Her eyes flew open. The room was lit by a glow that was not lamplight, cool and steady, like moonshine captured in a bowl. Ilara didn't sit up. She didn't dare move at all, as if stillness could keep the moment from shattering. She told herself it could only be a dream, and yet the air felt thick with reality, textured with it, as if she could reach out and tear away a veil. "Arik," she didn't say. Instead, her mouth shaped the name without sound, and her heart answered with a hard, bright ache. Steam rose from the kettle on the coals, though she had not lit a fire. The table was set with rice and herbs, arranged precisely as she would have placed them. There was the scrape of wood on wood, the chair across from hers, pulled back as if by a careful hand. When she finally found the courage to turn her head, she saw him. He was neither ghostly nor grand. He was simply Arik, as ordinary and miraculous as dawn. The line of his jaw arrested her with familiarity, the gentle slope of his shoulders, the weathered hands resting on the table, the little scar near his eyebrow from the day a branch snapped back while he was pruning. Everything was there, precise as memory, and yet something seemed sharpened, edges cleaner, colors deeper, like a world washed in rain. She didn't cry out. The body knows when to praise, and her silence was a form of kneeling. She waited for him to fade, and he didn't. He glanced toward her with the same look he had given her 1,000 mornings, checking without asking, loving without claiming. The look landed in her chest, like a bird returning to a nest it had never forgotten. Her hand lifted before her mind could speak against it. She reached across the table and touched him. Not air, not mist, warmth, the heat of skin shaped by sun and labor. If a dream, then a dream with a pulse. Her fingers hovered, astonished. He turned his palm and held her, as naturally as water holds a reflection. "Are you?" she began and stopped. The question was a wall she didn't want to build. He didn't speak. He only nodded toward the door, a small tilt of his chin that once meant, "Come, see what the morning is doing." And just like every other time, she obeyed. They walked out together into a night that shouldn't have been theirs anymore. The orchard stood whole, every fence mended, every fallen branch restored. The storm had been erased, or perhaps it now existed in a different country where sorrow still had permission to be king. The trees were heavy with fruit, though the season had not asked for abundance. When the wind moved, the leaves made that gentle conversation they'd always made, soft and endless, as if the world were confiding a secret to itself. They passed the barn. Its roof was unbroken, its door secure. Ilara's breath stuttered. Here was the place of the beam, the place of the blood on his temple, the place where a cry had torn the night in two. Here, too, was the furnace of her memory. But in this version of the world, there was only the smell of hay and the steady hush of animals sleeping. She waited for the old panic to rise and overwhelm her. It didn't. Instead, a curious hush moved through her, a space that was not the absence of pain, but its gentled cousin. Arik led her to the riverbank where the pyre had burned. She braced herself to meet the black mouth of ash. But the ground was soft with new grass, and among the blades lay white flowers Ilara had never seen before, small as fingernails, each glowing faintly as if collecting moonlight. She crouched and touched a bloom. It was cool, unfragile. It did not crumble. She opened her hand, and a petal remained on her palm like a tiny, living coin. A bell sounded far away, or inside her, she could not say. She turned and found that they were no longer by the river, but standing in their kitchen door again, as if space itself had inhaled and carried them home. The kettle murmured. The cup he favored waited where it always waited. Time felt like a lazy river flowing at whatever speed a heart could bear. Ilara studied him. She traced the familiar map of his face with her gaze, catalogued each contour as if to anchor him to the world by attention alone. If this was a dream, she thought, let it be the kind that teaches the waking how to live. Her throat worked. I thought you were gone, she whispered. I burned you. I watched. The next words failed, not because they were untrue, but because truth can be too heavy for any one sentence to carry. He reached for the oil lamp beside the window. There was no match, no ember, yet a steady flame blinked into being, as if summoned not by spark but by decision. He lifted the lamp and brought it close to her face. The warm light stroked her cheeks, revealing the road grief had drawn there. He did not recoil. He did not look away. He simply saw her, and under that gaze her wreckage felt less like ruin and more like proof. I loved, and the loving marked me. He moved to the hearth and set the lamp down. Then he took up a second wick and brought it to the first flame. The new wick caught, brightened, and held. The old flame did not diminish. Both burned, steady, side by side. He looked at her then, as if asking a question without words. She understood only part of it, that something can pass from one place to another without loss, that endings are a language the living learn before they learn the dialect of continuance. The understanding was not yet comfort, but it was more than despair. It was a hinge. Will you stay? She wanted to ask. Will you stay into morning? Will you stay until the house forgets how to be empty? But in that moment, the need to clutch him close loosened its grip. It didn't let go entirely. Grief never does. It only shifted, leaving room for a second thing to stand beside it without pushing it out. She felt the urge to test the world, to press against the edges of it the way a child presses a bruise to see if tenderness still lives there. If I wake, she said softly, may this be the last thing I remember. you lighting a new flame from the old. He stepped toward her, and the floor knew his weight. He took her hand again and lifted it, not to his chest, but to her own. The beat she felt was fierce, rattled, alive. He held her there until her breathing slowed and matched a rhythm that belonged to no storm. Then he lowered her hand and rested his palm over the center of her brow, an old gesture he'd used when she was feverish, to soothe, to cool, to convince her body it could trust the bed beneath it. "I will wake," she said, as if promising him rather than herself. "And when I do, I will listen." He smiled then, the small, private smile that had always been hers alone. It contained the memory of summers, the weight of winters, and the hush of meanings they had never had to say. Somewhere, a shutter closed gently against its frame. Somewhere, water traveled over stones. The world composed itself into quiet. The lamp's twin flames merged in her sight until they became a single, larger brightness. The room blurred, softened at the edges, as if reality were a paper lantern and someone was dimming the light within. She felt sleep approach, not like a collapse this time, but like a companion joining her on a walk she had been too tired to finish alone. "Don't vanish when I turn," she thought, half hopeless, half radiant with a trust she had no reason to own. She lay down on the mat on the floor, tucking the cloak beneath her head. She closed her eyes and still felt the weight of his palm at her brow, the way a boat still feels the river after it's been pulled onto land. When she stirred again, pale morning sifted through the window. The kettle was cool, the table held only one cup. The lamp sat by the hearth with its wick blackened, innocent as if it had never carried fire. For a moment, despair flared sharp, correcting, of course, but it didn't swallow her. Something else rose beside it, steady and spacious, and stood there too. She lifted her hand and found a smudge of ash at the base of her thumb. Perhaps she had touched the hearth in her sleep. Perhaps dreams leave fingerprints. She didn't rush to name it. She didn't reach to clutch the meaning. She simply breathed, and with each breath the room disclosed itself. Old wood, cooled clay, a faint trace of the herbs he'd loved to gather. None of it was miracle. All of it was new. A dream, she told herself, and knew that the word was both right and too small. A dream too real, real enough to steady her, real enough to ask something of her. Wake and listen. Wake and learn how to keep a flame without a match. Ilara rose. Her body moved like a creature that had found, if not strength, then a shape it could hold without breaking. She washed her face. She straightened the mat. She opened the door to the orchard and let morning enter, bringing with it the simple, audacious fact of another day. She didn't plan to tell the neighbors. She didn't plan to prove anything to anyone. Proof had become a less urgent religion. There was only the memory of heat in a hand she could no longer hold, and the lesson of light passed gently from one wick to another. When afternoon lengthened and shadows crossed the threshold, Ilara found herself listening not outward for thunder, but inward for the sound a heart makes when it is not arguing with the world. In that listening, she felt the dream return not as sight, not as touch, but as a nearness, as if meaning had pulled up a chair. And later, when night unfolded again and the house exhaled into silence, she lay down without bargaining. Sleep came like a tide, and on its first small wave something rose to meet her, a voice she knew as well as she knew her own breath. Ilara drifted into sleep again, as if surrendering to a tide she no longer feared. At first, there was only the soft murmur of night, the wind combing through leaves, the faint hush of water sliding down the riverbank. But within that silence came another sound, gentle at first, like the memory of a lullaby. It carried a cadence she knew instantly, though her heart almost refused to believe. Ilara. Her body jolted as if touched by fire. She opened her eyes, but the room was dark and still. No figure stood beside her bed, no flame burned in the lamp. Yet the sound had not been imagination. It vibrated through her bones, tender but steady, familiar as breath. She sat up, her pulse racing, hands gripping the edge of her mat. "Arik," she whispered into the shadows. The silence stretched, and then again, unmistakable. "Ilara, do not be afraid." The words bloomed inside her chest rather than falling on her ears. They did not echo through the walls. They rang within her heart like a bell struck at its center. She pressed her palm against her ribs, as if to steady herself, as if she could cradle the voice inside. "I thought I lost you," she whispered back, her voice breaking. "I burned your body. I buried your name in prayers. How are you here? How are you speaking to me?" The air grew warmer. It was not a heat that burned, but one that enfolded like standing in sunlight after endless winter. She closed her eyes and saw nothing but darkness. Yet the darkness itself seemed to hum with presence. "I am not far," the voice said. "Not farther than your own breath. Not farther than the flame you keep alive each time you remember me without despair." Her tears returned, but this time they carried a different weight, not sharp daggers of grief, but warm rivers easing against stone. She lowered her head and let them fall freely, her sobs shaping words she could barely form. "Why did you leave? Why must I carry this alone?" A pause, then, "Nothing leaves, nothing ends. The form changes, but what we shared is not broken. You cling to the cloak, to the cup, to the chair, but what lived between us was never wood, never cloth. It was breath, it was kindness. It was the trust that one day you would sit at the table and I would join you. That does not die." Her lips trembled. She wanted to argue. She wanted to demand his body back, his laughter in the orchard, his tired sigh when he lay down beside her at night. But the voice, his voice was so calm, so unyielding in its gentleness, that she could not raise anger against it. "You will wake tomorrow," he continued. "You will ache, yes, but do not mistake aching for absence. The ache is proof that love still burns." Ilara clutched the cloak tighter around her shoulders, rocking herself. "But I can't live like this. I can't live without you." "You will," he said, "not because you must, but because love itself will teach you. Even in pain, you are not without me. Even in loss, you are not lost. You will see me where you do not expect, in the neighbor's kindness, in the laughter of children, in the silence that holds you when you lie awake. You will see me most when you stop trying to hold me as if I was still flesh." The room brightened faintly, though no lamp was lit. She opened her eyes and saw the outline of his figure standing by the doorway, not solid, not ghostly, but something between. A shimmer, a presence clothed in memory and light. His eyes met hers, steady and soft, and though his lips did not move, she heard the words again, "Let me go where I must, and I will never leave." Her body shook. She crawled to the edge of the mat, reaching toward him. Her hand met air, but the warmth lingered, the same warmth she had felt when her palm was pressed to her chest in the dream. She let her arm fall, defeated, yet strangely comforted. The figure grew dimmer, fading back into the stillness of night. Ilara did not fight it. She sat in silence, clutching the cloak, and let her breath find its rhythm again. The words continued to echo inside her, "Do not mistake aching for absence." And for the first time since the night of the storm, she felt the tiniest shift, not the end of grief, but the birth of a new way to carry it. The night stretched long after his voice faded, yet Ilara could not tell if she was awake or still dreaming. Her body felt rooted in her room, the cloak heavy across her shoulders, but her mind floated in a space that was neither here nor there. The edges of the world had blurred, as if the barrier between realms had thinned enough for her grief to slip through. When she closed her eyes, she saw Arik's outline clear as day. When she opened them, she saw the room, yet the air shimmered, trembling like a veil caught in the wind. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, twisting into shapes that seemed to lean closer. The silence of the house was not empty but full, dense, alive with whispers just beyond hearing. Her heart raced. She whispered into the darkness, "Am I still dreaming?" But even her own voice sounded strange, echoed, layered, as if it came back to her from somewhere deeper, a cavern beneath the world. She rose to her feet. Her legs trembled, but she walked anyway, one slow step at a time. The floorboards beneath her creaked louder than usual, as though announcing her passage to unseen listeners. The air thickened with the scent of smoke and rain, the scent of that fateful night when she lost him. It was as if time itself had looped back, trapping her inside memory. Then she heard it, not his voice this time, but the murmur of many voices, layered and distant, like a crowd gathered just beyond a wall. Some wept, some laughed, some prayed. The sound rose and fell, carrying her into dizziness, until she gripped the doorway for balance. Ilara. The single voice cut through the multitude, clear, steady, achingly familiar. Arik's. She turned sharply, and there he was. Not in solid flesh, but not in formless mist either. A figure of light and shadow, standing where the lamplight should have ended. His eyes glowed with warmth, and in them she saw no accusation, no pain, only the depth of recognition. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her breath faltered. She wanted to run into his arms, to break the barrier, but her feet would not move. She felt as though a great river ran between them, invisible but undeniable. "You see me," he said, though his lips never moved. "Because you stand where worlds touch." Her chest tightened. "Am I dead?" she whispered, terror mixing with desperate hope. He shook his head slowly. "Not yet. You are alive, but grief has pulled you close to the threshold. Your sorrow thins the veil." She shuddered. The voices behind him grew louder, lamenting, chanting, calling. She saw shapes moving in the mist beyond, faces blurred yet familiar, as if the departed were gathering to witness her. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice trembling. "A bridge," he answered, "between the living and the gone. Few walk it, and fewer return unchanged. You did not choose it, but your heart opened the gate when it cried to the heavens." Ilara's knees weakened, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Then why show yourself? Why now?" His form flickered, light trembling like candle flame. "Because you are not meant to linger here forever. You must choose to cling to shadows, or to step fully into life again. I cannot decide for you." Her tears blurred the vision, but she blinked hard, unwilling to lose his shape. "How can I live without you?" "You live with me," he said softly, "not as before, but in ways you cannot yet see. What you love does not vanish. It changes. It flows. It waits in silence. Trust that. The voices in the mist surged, filling the air like waves crashing upon unseen shores. The pressure was immense, and Ilara clutched her chest, afraid her heart would burst. For a moment, she thought she might be pulled across, swallowed by the crowd of shadows. But then his voice steadied her. "Ilara, breathe. One breath anchors you to the living. Take it," she gasped, inhaling sharply, her lungs burning as though they were filling with fire and light. The mist recoiled slightly, the crowd of voices fading. Arik's figure dimmed, but his eyes lingered, steady on hers. "Between worlds, you have seen me," he said. "But when you wake, you must learn to see me in other ways. Do not return here searching for me. It will only deepen your sorrow. Instead, find me where life continues." And with that, his form dissolved into the stillness. The veil closed, the air lightened. The house was once again only a house. Ilara collapsed to her knees, drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. She pressed her forehead against the floorboards, torn between devastation and awe. She had crossed into something few ever glimpsed. She had spoken with him not in dream, not in madness, but in the fragile space between worlds. And though it left her shaken, a single truth echoed louder than fear. She was not entirely alone. The morning light poured gently into the small house, but to Ilara it felt strange, unreal, like she had woken into a world that was only half solid. Her body trembled with exhaustion from the night's ordeal, yet her mind refused rest. The memory of the voices, of Arik's form shimmering at the threshold, pulsed inside her like a heartbeat she could not silence. She moved through the house in silence, touching objects with cautious fingers as if each one might speak to her. The wooden cup he used each morning for tea. The chair he carved with his own hands, its back slightly uneven but full of care. The boots by the doorway, still dusted with earth from his last walk. They were all relics, but now they felt alive, charged with the same mystery that had filled the air between worlds. When she lifted the cup, her hands shook. The faint smell of tea leaves lingered, though it had not been used in weeks. She pressed it to her lips, and in the stillness she swore she heard him again, just a whisper, carried not by wind this time, but by memory itself. "Do not mistake aching for absence." Her breath hitched. She set the cup down quickly, afraid of what she might hear if she clung too long. But even when she tried to dismiss it as imagination, her heart whispered otherwise. It was not just memory, it was a message. Later, as she stepped outside, she felt the cold air embrace her. The orchard stretched silent, its bare branches swaying like mourners. She walked slowly among them, her fingers brushing the bark. At the base of one tree, she found a small carving his initials beside hers, etched years ago, when their love was still young. She had forgotten it was there. Now, seeing it again, her knees weakened. She touched the letters with trembling hands, and as her skin grazed the wood, she felt the echo of laughter the day he had carved it, teasing her about how crooked his handwriting looked. The memory surged so vividly, she nearly smelled the sweetness of apples ripening overhead. For an instant, she was there again, standing beside him, her hand held in his, the air full of summer. She gasped and pulled back. The orchard was bare again, cold and silent, yet she knew she had been given something, not just a memory, but a reminder, a messenger. That evening, As the sun lowered into blood-red dusk, she lit a single candle. Its flame wavered, flickering against the walls. She stared into it, her heart heavy with both fear and longing. And then, just as she began to close her eyes, the flame steadied, grew taller, brighter, as though refusing to be swallowed by the dark. Her breath caught. The sight filled her with the same warmth she had felt in his presence between worlds. Tears slid down her cheeks, but these were not only of sorrow. They carried wonder, gratitude, a faint stirring of faith. Perhaps Eric had been right. Perhaps the line between loss and love was not as final as she thought. Perhaps grief itself could become a doorway, turning memories into messengers that whispered not of despair, but of endurance. She pressed her palms together, bowing her head before the small flame. "If you are near," she whispered, "then teach me how to live with you in this silence. Teach me how to see." The candle swayed as though in answer, and her heart, though still broken, grew just a little softer. For the first time, she did not collapse beneath the weight of her sorrow. She sat in its presence, trembling but awake, and let the memories guide her not as chains, but as threads, weaving a fragile bridge between the life she had lost and the one she must still walk. The candle flame burned low, yet it held steady, as if defying the drafts of night. Ilara sat before it with folded hands, her face bathed in its golden glow. Something inside her had shifted, still tender, still aching, but different. For the first time, her grief was not only a prison, it had become a passage. As the hours passed, she whispered questions into the silence. Why must love end? Why must all things be torn away? Her voice cracked, but she no longer asked as a victim screaming into emptiness. She asked as a soul seeking understanding, sensing that perhaps the answers lay not in the return of her husband, but in the deeper truth behind all loss. That night, exhaustion finally overcame her. She drifted into uneasy sleep beside the candle, and in that dream, not the surreal threshold between worlds, but a quieter, clearer vision, she saw a figure approach. An old monk in simple robes walked slowly along a path of lotus petals. He carried a lantern, its light soft but unyielding, bright enough to guide but never to blind. His face was calm, his eyes deep wells of compassion. When he reached her, he set the lantern gently at her feet. "You are walking in darkness," he said, his voice like the steady flow of water over stone. "But the darkness is not your enemy. It is only the place where light has not yet entered." Ilara's tears returned. "I saw my husband. I spoke with him. He told me to breathe, to live, but I don't know how. I don't know how to keep walking when every step hurts." The monk nodded slowly. "You cling to what was, and in clinging, you bleed. All things change, child. The rose withers, the river shifts its bed, the flame burns down. You call it cruelty, but it is the nature of life itself." His words cut deep, but they carried no cruelty. They were simple, like truths she had always known but never dared to face. "If everything changes," she whispered, "then nothing is safe, nothing can be kept." He lifted the lantern and held it before her. "And because nothing can be kept, everything is precious. Do you not see? Impermanence is the very gift that teaches you to love fully, without delay, to release without hatred, to live without wasting." Ilara touched the lantern with trembling hands. Its warmth spread into her palms, steady and grounding. She felt her husband's presence in that warmth, not as a ghost, not as a phantom voice, but as love itself, freed from form. The monk leaned closer. Do not confuse absence with emptiness. Your husband has not vanished. He has returned to the great river that flows through all things. When you learn to see with eyes of wisdom, you will know him everywhere, in the wind, in the laughter of strangers, in the silence you once feared. The words settled in her like seeds dropped into fertile soil. For the first time, she felt a hint of what peace might mean, not the erasure of pain, but the transformation of it. When she awoke, the candle beside her had burned out. Yet the room did not feel dark. The vision lingered. The monk, the lantern, the lesson. She pressed her palms together once more, whispering to the silence, "Teach me to walk in this truth. Teach me to see with new eyes." Outside, the first light of dawn touched the horizon. She rose and stepped toward it, her grief still heavy, but her heart carrying a small flame, a lantern of wisdom that would guide her toward the path ahead. The morning after the dream, Ilara awoke with a strange steadiness in her chest. Her grief had not vanished, but it no longer howled like a storm. Instead, it simmered, quieter, as though wrapped in a thin layer of calm. She remembered the lantern in her dream, the monk's eyes, the warmth that had spread into her palms, and the words that refused to leave her mind. Impermanence is the gift that teaches you to love fully. Though it was still early, she stepped outside. The air carried the cool dampness of dawn, and the earth glistened with dew. For the first time in many weeks, she noticed the small things again, the song of a bird hidden among branches, the delicate trembling of leaves, the faint smell of wet grass. They were so ordinary, yet this morning they felt like signs, whispers of the lantern still burning within her. She wandered toward the edge of the village, where the old stone path led into the hills. She had no plan, only a pull inside her chest that guided her feet. She walked until the houses thinned and the trees grew taller, their shadows long against the rising sun. It was there, at a bend in the road, that she saw him. An old monk, just as in her dream, sat upon a flat rock beside the path. His robes were simple, the color of earth and clay. He held a walking staff across his knees, and his posture was neither tense nor weary, simply present, as though the very stone had been waiting for him. Ilara froze, her breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded as recognition swept over her. Though she could not be certain, though reason told her it was impossible, something within whispered, "This is him." The monk lifted his head and smiled gently, as though he had been expecting her. His eyes were deep, reflecting the morning light like still water. "You've come," he said softly. Ilara's lips parted, but no words emerged. She approached slowly, each step hesitant, as though afraid he might vanish like mist if she moved too quickly. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "I saw you last night, in a dream. You gave me a lantern." The monk nodded without surprise. Dreams are doors. Sometimes they open to illusions, sometimes to truth. What matters is not whether it was dream or waking, but what it planted in you. Tears welled in her eyes. "It planted hope, but I don't know how to hold it. My sorrow, it still devours me." He motioned for her to sit beside him. She lowered herself onto the stone, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. The silence stretched between them, yet it was not empty. It was the kind of silence that allowed the world to breathe. "Loss," the monk said finally, "is a teacher you did not ask for. It rips apart the illusions we cling to, that tomorrow is guaranteed, that love is possession, that control is possible. You have seen through the veil. Now the path opens. Ilara's tears slid freely. But how do I walk this path? I am only a broken woman, empty and afraid. The monk turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the sun climbed higher, painting the sky with fire and gold. You begin with one truth. All things change. Your husband has not left you in cruelty. He has simply obeyed the law of impermanence. Nothing you love can be held forever, but nothing is truly lost either. Life only shifts form. She pressed her hand against her heart, remembering Arik's shimmering figure, his voice telling her to breathe. I saw him. Between worlds. Was it real? The monk closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them slowly. What you saw was not fantasy. Love, when deep and pure, creates bonds that outlive flesh. He came because your sorrow had thinned the veil. But do not chain yourself to that threshold. The living must walk forward. Ilara's breath shook. And if I cannot? The monk placed his staff gently across her knees, the gesture firm yet tender. Then you will learn, not all at once, not without tears, but you will learn. Grief is not a wall, it is a river. If you stop fighting its current, it will carry you toward the ocean of wisdom. The words sank into her like stones falling into deep water. For the first time since Arik's death, she did not feel cursed. She felt invited, as if her suffering, unbearable as it was, might yet hold a hidden purpose. The monk rose, leaning lightly on his staff. Come, walk with me. There is a temple in the hills, and there we speak of impermanence not as sorrow but as liberation. You need not understand yet. You need only walk. Ilara looked at him, then at the rising path that disappeared into trees and mist. Her body still trembled with grief, but her feet longed to move. For the first time in months, she stood not to chase shadows, not to beg the heavens, but to follow the faint light of a lantern she now carried in her heart. And so she walked beside the monk, into the unknown, into the hills, into the beginning of healing. The path through the hills wound upward, lined with mossy stones and whispering pines. Ilara walked beside the monk, her breath uneven but steady, her heart caught between sorrow and curiosity. Every step felt like stepping into unknown country, not only in the forest but within herself. After a long silence, the monk spoke, his voice calm and resonant. Once, he began, there was a queen who possessed a diamond of unmatched brilliance. She wore it close to her heart, believing it made her life complete. Yet one day, while she bathed, a servant dropped the diamond, and it cracked upon the stone floor. The queen fell to despair, wailing as though her very soul had been broken. For days she cursed the servant, cursed fate, cursed life itself. At last, an old sage came to her and said, "Why do you suffer so greatly, my queen? Did you believe the diamond would never crack?" The queen shouted, "It was mine, it was perfect. How can I live knowing it is ruined?" The sage only smiled and picked up a fallen leaf, browned at the edges. This leaf too was once perfect and green, yet now it has changed. Does the tree curse the seasons, or does it grow still, year after year? The queen was silent. The sage placed the cracked diamond in her palm and said, "The diamond has taught you what all things will one day teach. Nothing lasts unchanged. If you learn to love knowing this, your heart will no longer shatter when the world shifts." The monk paused, letting the story sink into the air like incense. His eyes turned toward Ilara. "You see, child, the queen's suffering was not caused by the crack in the diamond. It was caused by her refusal to accept that all things, no matter how precious, are bound to change. That is impermanence." Ilara's throat tightened. She thought of Arik's laughter, the warmth of his hand, the sound of his footsteps across the floorboards. She had clung to them as if they were diamonds beyond breaking. And when they shattered, she had felt as though her very soul was torn apart. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Then, my pain is not only from his death, it is from my refusal to accept it." The monk nodded gently. "Yes, to love deeply is human, but to cling is to suffer. When you learn to hold without clutching, to cherish without chains, you will see that nothing is ever truly lost. It only changes form." She lowered her gaze, tears slipping down her cheeks. "But how do I learn this? My heart is too weak, my grief too heavy." The monk stopped and turned toward her. He lifted his staff and pointed to a small stream that ran beside the path, its water rushing over stones. "Look at the stream," he said. "The water does not resist the rocks. It does not curse the bends. It flows, always moving, always changing, yet always itself. Be like the stream, flow with life, not against it." Ilara crouched beside the stream, watching the water tumble and curl. She dipped her hand into it, and the coolness made her shiver. The current slipped through her fingers, impossible to hold. And yet was it gone? Number. It continued, part of something larger, endless. In that moment, she felt a flicker of understanding, fragile but real. Perhaps Arik had not vanished. Perhaps he had simply joined the current. The monk placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "The story of impermanence is not told to break your heart again. It is told to teach you how to live with a heart unbroken by change." Ilara pressed her hand to her chest, where grief and revelation tangled together. For the first time since the night of loss, she inhaled deeply, not the gasp of someone drowning, but the steady breath of one who is learning to swim. The path narrowed as the forest thickened, the canopy of pine and oak weaving shadows that dappled the ground in shifting light. Ilara walked slowly now, her mind heavy with the monk's parable. The diamond, the leaf, the stream, they lingered inside her like echoes, haunting but oddly soothing. Her grief still weighed on her chest like stone, yet for the first time she could sense it shifting. Not disappearing, no. The ache remained sharp. Her husband's absence still raw, but something inside her was loosening, if only slightly. The monk, walking ahead, stopped at a clearing where the stream broadened into a shallow pool. He motioned for her to sit upon a flat stone near the water's edge. She obeyed, folding her legs, resting her hands in her lap. "Ilara," he said softly, lowering himself onto the grass, "you cannot change what has already passed. To fight the truth is to fight with shadows. Tell me, how long have you been at war with what you cannot undo?" Her eyes burned, her voice trembling as it broke free. "Since the night he left me, every day I scream inside. Why him? Why not me? Why now? I replay every choice, every word, searching for the moment I might have stopped it. But I find nothing, only silence." The monk nodded. "That silence is your answer. Some doors close, and no force of will can open them. The heart suffers most when it pounds against a wall that will never move." Ilara's fists clenched on her knees. "But if I accept this, if I stop fighting, does that not mean I betray him, that I forget him?" The monk leaned forward, his eyes steady and kind. Acceptance is not forgetting. It is remembering without drowning. It is honoring what was, without chaining it to what must still be. Your husband would not ask you to live in ruins. He would ask you to live. The words cut through her like a blade, but not with cruelty. They carved space, as if her grief, clogged and tangled, suddenly had a way to breathe. Tears streamed down her face. "I don't know if I can." The monk gestured toward the pool. "Look into the water." She leaned forward. Her reflection stared back at her, pale, hollow-eyed, fragile. The sight made her flinch. "Do you see her?" the monk asked. Ilara nodded. "That woman has survived the fire of loss. She breathes, even when she wishes not to. She walks, even when her legs tremble. You do not honor your husband by breaking. You honor him by living with the strength he once loved in you. This is acceptance, not erasing your grief, but refusing to let it chain you to yesterday." Ilara's reflection blurred as tears dropped into the pool, rippling across the surface. In that trembling water, she saw herself shift, not whole, not healed, but moving. She closed her eyes, whispering, "Then teach me how to live without fighting what cannot be changed." The monk smiled faintly, as though hearing the most important vow she had ever made. "It begins with one breath, then another. In time, each breath will carry you further from the ruins, closer to the open fields of peace." Ilara inhaled deeply, shakily, but with intent. It felt like the first true breath of her new life, uneven, but hers. For a fleeting moment, the chains of resistance loosened. The grief remained, but it no longer pressed down with quite the same cruelty. Something inside her whispered, "Perhaps this is the beginning of freedom." The pool lay still before her, broken only by the occasional ripple of falling leaves. Ilara sat cross-legged, her body tense as though afraid to surrender to stillness. The monk lowered himself to the ground beside her, his robes folding into the grass. "Close your eyes," he said gently. "Do not think of yesterday. Do not reach for tomorrow. Only breathe." Ilara obeyed. Darkness met her behind closed lids, a space both frightening and strangely soft. Her chest rose and fell, shallow at first, as if her body resisted the simplicity of the task. "Feel the breath enter," the monk whispered, "cool as morning air. Feel it leave, warm with your sorrow. Again, in, out." She followed, in, out. Each breath trembled, but she clung to it like a rope in a storm. Her mind clawed at memories, Arik's laughter, the fire, the funeral chants. Yet each time they surged, the monk's voice anchored her back. "Let them pass," he murmured. "Do not fight them. Watch them, as you would clouds drifting across the sky. You are not your grief. You are the one watching." Something shifted. For the first time since her loss, Ilara felt herself separate from the weight pressing on her. The grief was there, yes, but it was not the whole of her. It was a storm above. She was the ground beneath. Her breath deepened. She inhaled slowly, the cool air filling her chest, and exhaled longer, letting go of a tightness she hadn't known she carried. With each cycle, her trembling lessened. The tears still came, but now they flowed like rain, not like knives. The monk's voice softened, as though carried by the very wind. "This is the first breath of peace. Fragile, fleeting, but real. Hold it not with your hands, hold it with your awareness." Time blurred. Minutes, maybe hours, passed in that gentle rhythm of breath and silence. When Ilara finally opened her eyes, the world looked the same: trees, stream, sky, but she was not the same. The edges of her despair had dulled. The forest felt less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary. She turned to the monk, voice hushed with awe. "It was only a breath, and yet I felt something lift." The monk smiled. "Peace does not come in torrents, it comes like drops of water upon stone. One by one they carve a river. Today you have felt the first drop." Ilara touched her chest lightly, astonished by the faint warmth still lingering there. For so long her heart had been a place of ruin. Now, for a brief moment, it felt like a place where something could grow. The monk rose slowly, leaning on his staff. "Remember this: when the nights feel endless, when grief rises again like fire, return to the breath. It will not erase your pain, but it will remind you. You are more than pain. You are the witness, not the wound." Ilara stood beside him, steadier than before. She looked at the hills ahead, the path winding further into mist. For the first time, she wanted to walk, not to escape, not to chase shadows, but to continue. And as the breeze stirred the trees around her, she realized the lantern she had once seen in dream was no longer outside her. It glowed softly within. The sun had shifted by the time Ilara rose from her meditation, its rays spilling through the trees in golden threads. For so long, light had seemed a cruel intruder, exposing the ruins of her life. But now, bathed in its warmth, she felt something different, like the world itself was whispering a welcome. She stood silently, listening. The stream gurgled as though laughing at its own persistence. Birds darted overhead, their wings catching flashes of light. Even the wind seemed alive, not as a mournful howl, but as a hymn. The monk's staff tapped softly against stone as he began to walk. Ilara followed, her steps hesitant but no longer dragging. She carried within her the memory of her breath, the stillness that had surfaced like a fragile blossom in winter. At last she spoke, her voice low but steady. "I don't know if I am ready. I don't know if I will ever be free of this grief." The monk stopped, turning to face her. His gaze held the weight of countless lives, countless sorrows, countless dawns. Freedom is not the absence of grief. It is the absence of chains. Grief may remain, but it need not bind you. Her chest tightened at his words. Chains, yes, that was what she had worn. Invisible shackles forged from resistance, from denial, from longing for what could not return. And in that moment, she realized she could choose. The storm had chosen for her the night it took Arik. Fate had written the cruel script of her widowhood. But here, now, she had a choice. To keep pounding against the locked doors of yesterday, or to walk through the open one before her. Her breath quivered as she whispered into the trees, as though speaking to Arik himself. "I cannot bring you back, but I can carry you with me, not as chains, but as light." The monk bowed his head, silent but approving. Ilara straightened her shoulders. For the first time, she felt not like a broken fragment, but like a whole, cracked, yes, scarred, yes, but whole in a new and unfamiliar way. She looked down the path stretching into mist. It was uncertain, it held no promises. Yet within that uncertainty lay life. "I will live," she said aloud, her voice trembling yet fierce. "I will live, not despite you, but because of you." The forest seemed to breathe with her, the leaves rustling like applause. The monk gave a small smile, his staff pressing firmly into the earth. "Then you have chosen life again. and in doing so, you honor both him and yourself." Ilara exhaled. It was not the gasp of despair, nor the shallow breath of survival, but a breath steady, deliberate, alive. She took a step forward, then another, and as she walked, her grief walked with her not as an enemy, but as a companion, reshaped by the truth of impermanence. She did not know where the road would lead, but she knew now that she would follow it. The path curved downward, leading Ilara out of the forest and into a valley she had not walked since before her world fell apart. The sight of rooftops startled her. Her village lay nestled among the fields, smoke curling gently from chimneys, children's laughter rising faintly into the sky. For months she had avoided this place. Every corner held memories: the bakery where Arik once bought her sweet rolls, the square where they had danced at festivals, the narrow lane that led to their now empty home. To return felt like tearing open an old wound, yet as she descended, something inside her urged her forward. The monk walked beside her in silence, as if knowing the weight of her steps. When they reached the first row of houses, Ilara paused, her breath caught. A woman at the well looked up, eyes widening. Recognition flickered across her face, not pity, not judgment, but something gentler. She raised a hand in greeting. Ilara hesitated, then lifted her own hand. The gesture, small and trembling, felt monumental. More faces appeared, neighbors she had hidden from, fearing their condolences would slice her raw heart. Yet now their eyes carried no daggers, they carried warmth. One man pressed fresh bread into her hands without a word. A child ran past, pausing only to smile shyly before disappearing again into laughter. Her chest tightened. She had expected the village to be a mirror of her grief, but instead it reflected something different: compassion. Not the kind that sought to erase her sorrow, but the kind that said, "We see you. You are still one of us." The monk leaned toward her and whispered, "Pain isolates. Compassion returns us to the circle of life." As she moved deeper into the village, the air seemed lighter. She found herself speaking softly at first, answering a neighbor's question about her health, then more openly as another asked if she needed wood for her fire. Her words stumbled, but they came, and with them came a fragile relief, as though each syllable helped her re-enter the world she had abandoned. When evening fell, the villagers gathered in the square for prayer. Lamps glowed like stars, swaying in the night breeze. The monk guided Ilara to sit among them. At first, she sat stiffly, afraid the closeness would suffocate. But then she heard the voices rise together, old and young, broken and whole, and something in her softened. She closed her eyes. The chant vibrated through her bones. It was not her husband's voice, but it was not silence either. It was life, weaving itself around her, carrying her along whether she resisted or not. A tear slipped down her cheek, not of despair but of gratitude. She had thought she was alone in her grief, exiled by loss. But the village had returned not as saviors, but as companions on the same fragile road. For the first time, she felt the truth. Sorrow shared did not diminish sorrow, but it made it bearable. As the prayer ended, lanterns lifted into the night sky, drifting upward in glowing clusters. Ilara watched them rise, her heart aching yet steady. She whispered to the wind, "I am not alone." The monk placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. "This is the way healing begins, not in solitude alone, but in the embrace of others. The village has returned, and so have you. The village square emptied slowly, the last lanterns drifting skyward like fading stars. Ilara lingered at the edge of the crowd, her heart strangely light, yet still carrying an undercurrent of unease. She had re-entered the circle of people, yes. She had felt warmth, but beneath that warmth, another truth stirred, a truth she had long buried. It came first as a whisper in her chest. Anger. For months she had smothered it under grief, ashamed of its presence, yet here it was, simmering like an ember. Anger at the storm for its merciless cruelty, anger at the gods for their silence, anger even at Arik for leaving her, though she knew it was not his choice, but most of all, anger at herself, for surviving when he had not, for being powerless to save him. She clenched her fists, nails biting into her palms. Why did I live? Why did he die? The monk, who had been watching her with patient eyes, stepped closer. You carry a flame, he said softly. If left untended, it burns only you. Tears sprang to her eyes. I don't want this anger, but it won't leave me, he nodded, because you are trying to push it away. What you resist clings tighter. Sit with it instead. Listen to it. Reluctantly, Ilara followed him back to the quiet of the temple steps. The night air was cool, the hum of insects steady like a heartbeat. She closed her eyes as he instructed, and for the first time, she turned toward the storm within. She felt the heat of her rage, sharp and bitter. She saw visions of the night flames devouring her home, water rising, her own helpless screams. The anger roared, "Why was I abandoned? Why must I suffer?" Her breath faltered, but the monk's voice steadied her. Do not judge it, do not fight it. Ask it what it hides. And slowly, beneath the fire, she felt something else. Pain. A childlike ache for love lost, for safety shattered. The anger was only a mask for fear and sorrow too heavy to bear. Her chest heaved, a sob escaped, raw and unguarded. She pressed her hands to her heart. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, not to the storm, not to the gods, but to herself. "I carried you all alone. I blamed you for surviving. Forgive me." The monk placed a lantern in her lap, its small flame glowing steady. "Compassion begins here," he said. "Not toward the world first, but toward yourself. When you forgive your own wounded heart, compassion flows outward." Ilara gazed into the light. For the first time, she saw her anger not as an enemy but as a wounded child, thrashing only because it had been ignored. She breathed deeply, cradling it in her awareness. The heat softened, shifting into something warmer, gentler, and in that moment, she imagined Arik's face not as a ghost of longing, but as a smile urging her onward. She whispered into the night, "I forgive you for leaving. I forgive myself for staying. May we both be free." The lantern flame flickered, brighter for an instant, as though echoing her words. When she opened her eyes, the anger had not vanished, but it had changed. It no longer burned her from within. It glowed, a reminder of love, loss, and the fragile humanity that connected her to every soul in the village and beyond. The monk's voice was quiet but firm. "This is the alchemy of the heart. Anger transformed into compassion. It is not magic, it is practice, and it begins anew each day." Ilara rose, lantern in hand, her body weary but her spirit lighter. She knew the road was long, but now she carried not just sorrow, not just rage, but compassion, tender and alive. The days that followed unfolded like the slow opening of a flower. Ilara still woke some mornings with the heavy stone of grief pressed against her chest. But alongside it, a fragile thread of hope began to weave through her hours. It started with the simplest of moments. One morning, while fetching water from the well, she heard a child giggling as he tried to balance a stick on his nose. The sound startled her, bright, unfiltered, innocent. For the first time in months, the corners of her lips trembled upward. The smile was fleeting, but real. Later she passed the bakery. The smell of warm bread drifted into the air, carrying her back to days when Arik would sneak rolls into his pockets for her. At first, the memory pricked like a thorn, but then she noticed the baker's daughter dusted with flour, her cheeks flushed with effort. She was kneading dough with clumsy determination. Something softened inside Ilara. She stepped closer, offering a tip her husband once gave her. Fold with patience. Bread rises better when handled with kindness. The girl's eyes lit up. It was the first time Ilara had given, rather than withdrawn. That evening, she sat outside her small hut and noticed the sky ablaze with colors, crimson melting into violet, then into the soft hush of night. She realized she had not looked at a sunset since Arik's death. She had not allowed herself. Yet here it was, waiting for her as it always had. She whispered, "The world still paints, even when hearts are broken." The monk's words returned to her. Impermanence is not only loss, it is also renewal. Each small joy was a seed, not a denial of grief, but a reminder that alongside sorrow, life continued to offer its gifts. A neighbor dropping off herbs for her cooking, a stray dog nuzzling her hand, the cool relief of river water splashed against her face after hours of work in the field. One afternoon, as she weeded the neglected patch behind her home, she found a sprout pushing stubbornly through the soil. She had not planted it. Likely, it was a seed carried by wind or bird. Yet, seeing it there green, alive, reaching stirred something deep in her chest. She knelt beside it, pressing her hand into the earth. "You remind me," she whispered, "that even in ruins, life insists on returning." For the first time, she felt not only the absence of Arik, but also his presence in these small miracles. The bread's warmth, the laughter of children, the resilience of plants. Perhaps, she thought, he lived on not just in her heart, but in the quiet rhythm of life itself. The monk, visiting her garden that evening, smiled at the tiny sprout. "Hope is like this," he said. "It begins small, almost hidden, but with care it grows, and soon it bears fruit not only for you, but for others." Ilara touched the sprout gently. The soil smelled rich, alive, and within her, something long buried shifted a willingness to believe that joy, however fragile, still belonged to her. That night, as she lay down, she realized her tears had changed. They still fell, but not only from sorrow. Some came from gratitude for bread, for sunsets, for laughter, for life continuing, for seeds of new hope. The nights had once been Ilara's greatest torment. When the village quieted, when the lamps were extinguished and the stars blinked awake, she was left alone with her thoughts. Silence was no comfort. It was a vast ocean where grief swelled and crashed, pulling her deeper into despair. But slowly, under the monk's guidance, night began to change. One evening, he handed her a small oil lamp, its flame steady in the darkness. "Each night," he told her, "let this flame be your teacher. Watch it until your mind grows still, then close your eyes. Instead of fighting sleep or clinging to pain, surrender like the flame surrenders to air. She obeyed. That night, she sat on her mat, the flame flickering gently. At first, her mind stormed with memories. Eric's laughter, the weight of his absence, the fury of the storm. Her chest tightened, tears threatened, but she breathed deeply, remembering his instruction. Let the thoughts pass as clouds. The lamp's glow blurred as her eyes softened. She followed the rhythm of her breath in, out, steady, calm. For the first time in months, her body loosened before sleep. And when sleep came, it was not a fall into a pit, but a gentle descent, as though she were floating on water. The next morning, she awoke, not healed, but rested, and that, in itself, was a small miracle. Night after night, she practiced. She learned to lay her grief gently on the ground beside her, like a heavy cloak she did not need to carry into dreams. She whispered mantras the monk had given her. This moment is enough. This breath is enough. I release what I cannot hold. The nightmares did not vanish entirely. Sometimes she still woke weeping, but more often now, she found herself dreaming of gardens, of rivers, of Eric's smile, unshadowed by death. She realized that sleep, once her enemy, had become a sanctuary, a place where she could touch peace, if only for a few hours. And in those hours, her strength quietly grew. Neighbors noticed. Her eyes, though still lined with sorrow, no longer carried the same exhaustion. She moved with more steadiness, her voice less brittle. Even the children, sensing the change, came closer to her, no longer afraid of her grief. One night, after her meditation, Elara blew out the lamp and whispered into the dark, "Sleep is not escape. It is surrender. It is trust that life will hold me until morning." The stars seemed to glimmer brighter in response. For the first time since the storm, she no longer dreaded the night. She welcomed it. Each night was a soft teacher, reminding her, letting go was not losing. It was allowing the heart to rest, so it could rise again with the dawn. It was in the quiet of another dawn that Elara first understood the strange, liberating beauty of letting go. She had risen early, as had become her habit, and walked barefoot to the small patch of earth she tended. The sprout she once discovered had grown taller, its leaves trembling in the morning breeze. She crouched to touch its stem, marveling at how strong and delicate it had become. In that moment, she realized something profound. She had not controlled this plant's growth. She had only watered it, cared for it, and then released it to the sun, the rain, the mysteries of nature. Its flourishing was not her possession, it was a gift. The monk, who often visited her in these early hours, watched her silently. When she turned to him, he said, "To care without clinging, this is the heart of freedom." His words echoed within her. For months, she had clung tightly to Eric's memory, to her guilt, to her anger, even to her grief. She had feared that loosening her grip meant dishonoring him or losing the last pieces of their love. But now, standing in the soft light of dawn, she felt otherwise. She remembered his laughter, how freely he had given it, without demand. She remembered the way he would leave a loaf of bread on their neighbors' doorsteps, asking for nothing in return. His love had never been possession. It had been a gift, too. Tears filled her eyes, but they were not the bitter tears of despair. They were tender, cleansing. She whispered into the wind, "I release you, Eric, not to forget you, but to let you live in me without chains." May you be free. May I be free. A stillness settled over her heart, deeper than she had ever known. The grief did not vanish, but it no longer bound her. It flowed like a river, moving, changing, carrying her forward. The monk placed a hand over his chest and bowed slightly. Non-attachment is not the absence of love, he said. It is love in its purest form. It is loving without fear of loss, giving without expecting return. It is what allows us to walk lightly through this world. Ilara closed her eyes and felt the truth of it. She had thought letting go was a death. Instead, it was a birth of freedom, of compassion, of love that did not cling but embraced everything. That evening, when she prepared for sleep, she did not whisper mantras of desperation. Instead, she breathed with ease and said simply, "Thank you for what was, for what is, for what will come." And for the first time, she felt her body rest, not because she was exhausted, but because she was at peace. The beauty of letting go had revealed itself, and in that beauty, Ilara felt closer to Arik than ever, not as a ghost to be grasped, but as love woven into the fabric of life itself. There was a time when the villagers spoke of Ilara only in whispers, their words wrapped in pity, the widow who lost everything. She was the woman haunted by fire, by flood, by the cruel emptiness of fate. They had seen her stagger through the streets in torn garments, her face hollowed by grief, her eyes like dark wells of sorrow. But seasons passed, as they always do, and now, when people spoke of her, the tone was different. They said, "The widow who once lost everything, but found a way to live again." She walked with quiet dignity, her steps no longer heavy, her hands, once clenched in rage and despair, now carried baskets of herbs, bread, and flowers to share with neighbors. Her voice, once trembling with cries of "Why me?" now flowed with gentle encouragement, often guiding others through their own storms of loss. Children who once avoided her door now gathered there at dusk, listening as she told them stories, not of ghosts or endless sorrow, but of courage, compassion, and the river of life that flows even when we are broken. The widows of the village came to her too, their faces streaked with fresh tears, and she sat with them in silence, sometimes offering words, sometimes only presence. She had become what she once longed for, a lantern in the dark, and yet, deep inside, she did not deny her past. She remembered every detail, the crackling fire, the thunderous waters, the night she cried into the heavens with nothing left. Those memories were not chains anymore. They were part of her, like scars on the skin, reminders of wounds survived, proof that healing was possible. The monk once told her, "You are not the woman who lost everything. You are the woman who walked through fire and flood, and yet remained. Your loss has carved space for wisdom, as the river carves valleys into stone." Standing by the riverbank one evening, Ilara finally understood. She was not defined by loss, but by transformation. The woman who once clung to despair had learned to release. The widow who once stood at the edge of the abyss now walked with compassion. She gazed at her reflection in the water. The lines on her face were deeper now, carved by sorrow and time. But in her eyes there was light, the kind of light that comes only after darkness. And so, the widow who once lost everything was no longer only a story of tragedy. She had become a story of rebirth. The question lingered in Ilara's heart like a distant bell. When everything is taken, what remains? She had asked it on the night her husband died, her fists pounding against the cold earth. She had asked it through sleepless nights, when grief howled through her like a storm. At first, her answer was simple and sharp. Nothing remains, only emptiness. But time and practice had softened that belief. One afternoon, Ilara sat beneath the great banyan tree near the edge of the village. The children had run off to play, and the air was filled with the scent of jasmine carried by the wind. She closed her eyes, breathing slowly, and felt into the silence. And there, within the stillness, she found it, a thread, subtle yet unbreakable. It was not her house, long gone, not the possessions swept away by the storm, not even the warm touch of her husband's hand. What remained was something deeper, something the flood could not wash away, the fire could not consume, and death could not sever. It was love, not the clinging love that demands or fears, but the quiet essence of it, the love that had been born in her heart and still pulsed there. It was present when she comforted another widow. It shimmered when she shared bread with the hungry. It whispered when she sat in stillness, remembering Arik not with pain, but with gratitude. She realized that what truly remained was not an object, not a person, but the capacity to love and to be aware. The monk's teachings echoed. Everything passes, yet awareness remains. The river carries away the branches, the stones, the leaves, but the water keeps flowing. The current itself is never lost. Ilara opened her eyes and looked at the village around her. Children's laughter rang through the air. The monk's prayer bell sounded from afar. A neighbor waved from her garden. Life had not stopped when her world collapsed. It had shifted, it had changed, but it had continued. And in that continuity, she saw her husband again, not in visions or dreams, but in the kindness he once gave, which now lived through her. His presence was no longer bound to flesh or form. It had dissolved into the great current of life, flowing through her heart into the world. Tears gathered in her eyes, but they were gentle, almost sweet. She whispered, "I thought I had lost everything, but love remains, awareness remains, life remains." For the first time she felt that nothing truly perishes. Everything transforms. Everything returns in another shape, another moment, another breath. She leaned her head against the trunk of the banyan tree and smiled. What remains when all is gone is not emptiness. It is the spaciousness that allows love and wisdom to bloom again. For most of her life, Ilara had feared impermanence. To her, it had been a thief, the force that stole her husband, her home, her peace. When she thought of impermanence, she thought of endings, of grief, of the cruel unraveling of everything she held dear. But one morning, as dawn broke over the horizon, she walked to the river's edge and watched the waters flow. The current shimmered with gold, carrying fallen leaves downstream. Birds skimmed the surface, their wings touching the water only for a breath before rising again. Nothing lingered, nothing clung, and yet the river was beautiful precisely because it moved. The monk joined her and stood silently at her side. After a time he said, "Impermanence is not your enemy, Ilara. It is your teacher. Without it, no seed could grow, no wound could heal, no grief could fade. Without impermanence, love would not bloom, and compassion would never deepen." She listened, the words sinking into her like sunlight warming cold skin. Her mind traveled back to that night, the roar of the storm, the collapse of her world. Pain still rose at the memory, but now it no longer crushed her. Instead, she could see, It was impermanence that had destroyed, yes, but it was also impermanence that had carried her here, to this moment of peace. If nothing ever changed, she would still be trapped in grief's prison. It was change that had opened the gates. Ilara closed her eyes and whispered, "What once I called my curse is my greatest gift." The monk smiled gently. Impermanence teaches us to let go, to cherish, to live fully in this fleeting breath. To fear it is to fear life itself. To embrace it is to walk in freedom. She opened her hands, palms facing the river. In her heart, she felt it. Impermanence was not only loss, but also possibility. It was what allowed her to rise from ashes, to rebuild, to transform her love into compassion for others. It was the reason flowers bloomed, rivers flowed, children grew, and even sorrow softened into wisdom. Tears welled, not from despair but from gratitude. She had been given the greatest teaching, one carved not in books, but in her own life. Looking at the river, she murmured, "Thank you, impermanence, for breaking me and for remaking me." The water sparkled as though bowing in return. When Ilara first began to speak, her voice trembled. She was not used to offering her story. For so long it had been her private wound, a scar she carried in silence. But the widows who came to her door, the young mothers who had buried children, the farmers who had lost fields to storms, they needed more than bread or herbs. They needed a voice that understood. So she began. She told them of the night her world collapsed. She painted the flames in the sky, the roar of waters, the silence that followed. She spoke of wandering through ruins with nothing left, of asking the heavens, "Why me?" She did not hide her rage or her despair. She showed them the raw wound, because she knew they carried the same. But then she told the rest. She spoke of the monk, who had reminded her that control was an illusion. She spoke of the shadows that had haunted her, and the moment she realized they were only fragments of clinging memory, she told of the first breath of peace that came with meditation, the tiny sprout she cared for, the villagers who returned, the beauty of letting go. Her story was not polished, not free of tears. Sometimes her voice broke, but the villagers listened with rapt attention, and in their eyes she saw her own journey reflected. One young widow grasped her hands tightly and whispered, "You are the first to say what I have felt, but could never name." Another woman said, "If you can walk through that night and still live, maybe I can too." Ilara understood then that her pain had not been wasted. It had become a bridge, something that allowed her to meet others in their darkness and lead them toward the faint glow of dawn. She did not claim to be a teacher, yet her story carried the weight of truth. She did not claim to heal, yet people left her presence lighter. She did not claim wisdom, yet wisdom bloomed in her words because it had been watered with tears. The monk, seeing her speak to the villagers, said softly, "Your suffering has become your gift. By walking through it fully, you now carry the lantern that others may follow." Ilara bowed her head. She no longer wished her pain away. She no longer cursed the impermanence that had torn her life apart, for in its wake, she had been remade into a vessel of compassion. From that day forward, her home became a place of quiet gathering, not a temple, not a shrine, but a circle of presence where grief could be spoken and hope could be born. Her suffering had once isolated her. Now, it united her with the suffering of others, and through that unity, she found the deepest kind of peace. The night grew quiet around Ilara. The river whispered softly in the distance, and the stars hung like lanterns across the sky. She sat by the window of her small home, the same window she had once stared through with tears that would not end. Now, her gaze was calm. She whispered to herself, "I was the widow who lost everything, but in losing, I found peace. And in finding peace, I learned to give." Her story was no longer only hers. It had become a mirror for others to see themselves in, a reminder that loss does not end the story, it transforms it. Her husband lived on in her compassion, her suffering lived on in her wisdom, and her peace, she hoped, would live on in those who listened. Ilara closed her eyes and breathed deeply. Each breath was no longer a battle against sorrow, but a surrender to life as it is. The monk's words lingered. Rest is not the absence of loss, but the embrace of impermanence. To rest is to let life flow without resistance. And so, she rested. As her body softened into stillness, she felt herself dissolve into the great rhythm of life, the rise and fall, the meeting and parting, the joy and the sorrow. She was no longer only the widow. She was the river, the tree, the stars above, the breath of every soul who had ever grieved and healed. And now, dear listener, her story becomes yours. Perhaps you too carry loss. Perhaps you too have asked the heavens, "Why me?" If so, know this: you are not alone. Within you is the same strength that guided Ilara through the storm. Within you is the same lantern of wisdom, waiting to be lit. As you rest tonight, may her journey remind you that impermanence is not an enemy, it is a gift. Loss does not take away love. Change does not destroy what is essential. And peace is always waiting, just beyond the letting go. So, close your eyes now. Let your breath deepen. With each inhale, feel the presence of life. With each exhale, release what you no longer need. You have walked with Ilara through fire, through sorrow, through dreams and shadows, through the quiet dawn of compassion. And now, it is time for you to rest. May you drift into sleep with the blessing of the Buddha's wisdom. May your heart be light, your mind unburdened, your body at ease. Tonight, may you find your own final rest, the kind that heals, the kind that comforts, the kind that whispers, "You are whole, even in loss." Good night, dear listener. May you be well, may you be free, may you know peace. And if this story has touched you, let it live on, share it, return to it, and walk with us again. Thank you for walking this journey with us tonight. If Ilara's story brought you comfort, remember there are many more stories waiting to hold you through the night. You can continue this path of peace by exploring our full collection of Buddhist sleep stories and Zen teachings. Each story is crafted to ease your heart, calm your mind, and guide you gently into rest. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and join our growing circle of listeners around the world. That way, you'll never walk alone in the dark. You'll always have a lantern beside you. Now, let yourself drift deeper, knowing the next story will be here when you are ready.